Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Michael Breish. I'm an energy policy specialist in the State Energy Office within the Department of Commerce, where I'm responsible for transportation policy. I work on electrification of all modalities, supporting local government efforts, equity initiatives, and the Clean Energy Fund. And as a plug-in for my work, we have about $9 million for an electrification of transportation systems coming up, so if you're interested in that, please come find me afterwards. I'm grateful for the opportunity to be your moderator for today's Transit Talk, sponsored by Transportation Choices Coalition, an organization that works towards thriving and equitable transit communities. Thank you all for joining us today. I'd like to extend a thank you to Councilmember Johnson's office for coordinating use of this great space. Thank you to the Seattle channel for recording this event so we can share it with others and keep the conversation going. Thank you all for spending your lunch hour with us. I hope it's super yummy. So last month, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released its new climate report that made it clear that it is extremely urgent to act on climate change and reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. One critical solution is to clean up Washington's transportation sector, which is the single largest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions in the state. This January, during the legislative session in Olympia, we have an opportunity to advocate for policies that do just that, while also reducing air pollution, congestion, stormwater runoff, while also increasing health, mobility, affordability, and safety. At last night's TCC's end-of-year celebration, they unveiled their 2019 legislative priorities, which include supporting bills establishing a state commitment to environmental justice in the Washington Department of Transportation, supporting bills that reduce greenhouse gas emissions and air pollution through a clean and equitable transportation system, including multimodal infrastructure, demand management, and electrifications of fleet and transit. Advocating for more sustainable transportation infrastructure, such as bike facilities, sidewalks, complete streets and buses, and demand management strategies to avoid trips altogether. Today with you and our partners, we will join together in discussion around the intersection of equitable and clean transportation solutions and how to determine how we can work towards creating community-driven equitable strategies and build cross-sector coalitions. We're joined by a great panel of experts and leaders from a variety of organizations, all with very unique perspectives on today's topics. I will briefly introduce each speaker. Their full bio is in your handout. After all of the introductions, each panelist will have 5 minutes to present. After presentations, the audience will have time to ask questions. We have placed 3x5 note cards on your seats for you to write your questions on. After the presentations, we will collect the cards and field them to me. Also note on your seats, there's a slip of paper asking you what you think the next transit talk should be about and where. Please take the opportunity to tell us what you want to talk about. Thank you to Keiko Budich for live tweeting today. You can follow along at Transpo Choices using hashtag Transit Talks and add to the conversation your thoughts and ideas. So now I'm going to introduce the panelists. Our first speaker is Bryce Yadon, State Policy Director at Futurewise. Bryce has a BA in Political Science from Seattle University and a Master's in Environmental Sustainable Management from Middlesex University in London. He has worked for Futurewise for the past 4 years, and his prior work included being an aide to the chair of the Senate Transportation Committee and an aide to the chair of the House Housing Committee. His work focuses on land use housing, environmental protections, and the connection with transportation policy. Next is Debolina Banerjee, is the Climate Justice Policy Analyst at Puget Sound Sage. Banerjee, I'm so sorry, Debolina. I apologize. Her responsibilities include research-based analysis of climate policies, campaign support on climate justice issues, and building power within SAGE's local and statewide climate coalitions. She has research experience in transit-oriented development, environmental impact of unorganized industries, and climate change on underinvested communities and project management for real estate development. In addition, Debolina has extensive experience working with grassroots activists in marginalized communities in India organizing for social justice around food, sustainable agriculture, clean environment, community development, and women's empowerment. Next is Rebecca Ponzio. She's the Climate Program Director with Washington Environmental Council. She joined WEC in 2013 and has more than a decade of experience in environmental policy and advocacy. At WEC, Rebecca has managed the broad coalition fighting oil infrastructure through Stand Up to Oil campaign, which has stopped oil terminals across Washington and Oregon. She now directs the Climate and Fossil Fuel Program, working on both passing proactive climate policy while at the same time stopping new fossil fuel infrastructure from being built. And finally, we have Don Mackenzie, who leads the Sustainable Transportation Lab at the University of Washington, where he's an assistant professor of civil and environmental engineering. With sponsorship from automotive industry and federal, state, and local governments, the lab develops and evaluates technical and policy solutions for making our transportation system more economically vibrant and environmentally benign, while providing access to opportunities for all. He is a member of the Transportation Research Board Standing Committee on Transportation Energy and chairs its subcommittee on energy and demand implications of connected and automated vehicles. So let's get started with Bryce. So everyone has 5 minutes, and then we'll just go down the line, ending with Don, and then don't forget to fill out your note cards and pass them along to staff who will collect them. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you. Again, Bryce Yadon. I'm the State Policy Director with Futurewise. Futurewise is an environmental land use organization. We were formed in 1990 to uphold and enforce, if you will, the Growth Management Act. The Growth Management Act is a land use planning policy, and the best thing about it is it's arguably one of the first climate policies Washington actually passed in 1990. It's not really known as a climate policy act, but when you actually do your planning correctly, you're building livable, dense communities, which helps reduce your reliance on single occupancy vehicles, provides access to opportunity through transit and stuff like that. I'm going to keep it really short and quick because I think there's other people that have a lot to say, and I'd rather take your questions. But as I said, land use is really Futurewise's connection to the climate and to the transportation sphere. And really what we're looking at in the 2019 session in terms of what Futurewise will be working on is there's a whole host of new planning types of legislation, such as minimum density requirements. What does that look like? What do we talk about when we're actually trying to add development capacity in cities? How can we create that to be an equitable outcome? And finding out how do we actually use the limited transportation infrastructure that we have and the resources that we have. The latest forecast came out, and the multimodal account, which actually funds our transit system at the state level, is down around $600,000 for next year, and we're looking at about a $3 million deficit over the next couple of years. So when we look at stuff like that, we have to make sure that we're really focusing on how our land use practices are working so we can get the best out of our transportation system. The final thing I will say in terms of really looking at climate equity, Futurewise has been trying to figure out how do we actually include a climate element in the Growth Management Act. There's 14 requirements that you have to plan for: housing, transportation, but one thing that's greatly lacking is a climate aspect to that. And we're hoping in the next few years we can slowly bring that to the forefront as many of our partner organizations work on other aspects of the climate policy. If we can embed that planning process, we think it'll go a long way. Thanks.
Hello, everybody. So I'm Debolina Banerjee. My organization is Puget Sound Sage. Just to give a brief intro about it, we are a multi-issue policy advocacy organization. We work with grassroots communities here in Seattle, take cues on them on policy issues. We work at interconnected issues like affordable housing, accessible transit, climate justice, and workplace democracy. Is that okay? Okay. Okay. And we were also a founding member of Front and Centered, which is a coalition of around 60 environmental justice organizations led by people of color across the state. And we help Front and Centered inform their policy decisions and campaigns as well. So what I'm going to talk a little bit about is our priorities for this year and coming year, which aligns with the big climate priority for the state and the city, which is electric vehicles. So we all know that transportation is one of the major causes of greenhouse gas emissions, around 40 to 45% over the state and also in King County. And people look to transit as a solution to mitigate and reduce emissions. So cities, counties, state, everybody has adopted a goal until 2030 to phase out fossil fuels and to have more renewable energy and new technology to help transportation. Electric vehicles has been chosen as one of the high priority strategies for this. But for our job and our focus is to ask the questions as to how this technology benefits communities. Who does it leave out and who does it benefit? Like while this is an excellent strategy in itself, does it actually address racial inequity, income inequity in transportation access and transit access? So communities of color, low-income communities, we all know, face the maximum burden of climate change, and they often live in neighborhoods which have the worst air quality and worst environmental quality. So are these communities who need electric vehicle technology the most able to access it? I'll just give a very brief about some of the broader strategies that we have looked into. Can we target the benefits of electric vehicles technology in terms of like wealth and income and by geography? So within Front and Centered, we have developed a tool called the Environmental Health Mapping Tool. We worked with the state and University of Washington to develop it. Hopefully it'll come live in 2019. And we could use such tools that exist all across the state and in counties as well to identify where these communities live, who are most burdened by air pollution, who do not have access to transit, etc. And the other thing would be assessing the policies. We need to do community needs assessment to target the benefits of these technology and see, for example, is it relevant? For example, let's say rural community, they might be using electric vehicle technology for their personal use, but then it might not be feasible for long haul because the technology does not exist for heavy vehicles yet. But for an urban poor community, that might be what could be a major source of, or major mode of transportation. And there are other tactics too in terms of transit and all, which I'd love to actually discuss later on in the question session.
Do you want me to, or do you want to? Okay. Hi, I'm Rebecca Ponzio with the Washington Environmental Council, and I'm also here representing the Washington Conservation Voters. Just briefly about those two organizations, Washington Environmental Council is a statewide advocacy organization driving positive change to solve our state's most critical environmental challenges for over 50 years. Our mission is to protect, restore, and sustain Washington's environment for all. And Washington Conservation Voters is our political branch focusing on achieving strong environmental protections by electing and supporting officials and holding them accountable. Our vision at WCV is that all people in Washington have a healthy environment and a strong, sustainable economy. Both Washington Environmental Council and Conservation Voters have adopted racial justice plans as part of our strategic plans, recognizing that as historically white-led environmental groups, we have work to do to advance environmental policy in a way that dismantles the oppressive systems that we are all living in. Our transportation system is one of those. I want to focus my time right now on what is in play this upcoming session and thoughts on how to move forward those policies in an equitable way that both breaks the monopoly of the oil industry and advances a clean transportation system for the health of everyone. So for many years, we've seen in the legislature that progressive transportation policy has been pitted against revenue. We saw this in the budget package that included a poison pill that would have removed transit funding if a clean fuel standard passed. And we've seen that in money for an incentive program, electric vehicle incentive program, that was coming out of an already limited multimodal account. This is not how they should be. They should not be pitted against each other. Now we have a significant number of newly elected legislators who ran and won on the environment, and a strong push for climate action. And we have a chance to break that destructive cycle. So earlier this week, Governor Inslee put out some key goalposts for taking action on climate. He described 5 priority areas. including transportation, which I'm going to hone in on. And now we all have the opportunity to weigh in and educate and advocate what it should look like to be equitable in those policies. So the first one is adopting a clean fuel standard, kind of breaking that poison pill, which is a market-based approach to require less carbon-intensive fuels, from electrification to biofuels to other fuels. And this is a key policy to get off fossil fuels, but it's also important to do it in an equitable way. This work is happening at two different scales of government, both being proposed at the state scale as well as the Puget Sound Clean Air Agency, which is a 4-county region. A couple thoughts on how to do this in an equitable, more equitable way is having mechanisms that target greater investments in pollution reduction in communities hardest hit by congestion and pollution, teeing off the work that Debolina and her colleagues have been doing to identify those communities. Putting in place a way to track progress over time, including jobs and co-pollutant reduction, incentivizing clean jobs for people here in Washington, so it's not elsewhere, and ensuring that the policy applies to all types of transportation. Again, following on what Debolina said, things like heavy-duty vehicles and single-occupancy vehicles, this should apply to everything. Another policy in play is extending and reevaluating the electric vehicle incentive, that one that pits the money against transit funding, to buy both new and used electric vehicles. And this is important to do, but needs to include various considerations, including making sure that the funding isn't pitting climate action against another set of transportation priorities, addressing some of the long-standing issues around promotion of electrification for wealthy people and not everyone, and increasing the accessibility and affordability of electrification infrastructure. That all needs to be wrapped up in that type of policy. Another one in play, highlighted by the governor, is passing a zero-emission vehicle standard to bring more electric vehicles into the state. This would align with what California already has. And finally, making electric vehicle charging infrastructure more accessible, for example, working with utilities to incentivize this type of infrastructure. So although the work to reduce our climate pollution from the transportation system is a multi-year effort, and Bryce and many others have been working on this for many, many years, we have a unique opportunity in 2019. The governor put out goalposts, and we are all more organized and more aware of what we need to do now than ever before. There's also great interest thematically from the federal scale all the way down to investing in infrastructure with ideas like the Green Deal package. And we're definitely seeing that conversation here at the state. We know that our transportation system overall needs a lot of investment, and that there are synergies between land use and water quality, jobs, and equity, and much more. And the more that we can seek opportunities to synchronize multiple benefits, the better off we are in advocating for these policies. In addition to specific policy refinements, I think it's important that there's greater transparency and engagement opportunities in shaping these policies with everyone, and that will help make it more equitable. Finally, one other thing that's in play and comes up again and again and again is revenue, transportation revenue discussions. Bryce mentioned the massive gap. That is always a topic of conversation. We are expecting a proposal to increase the gas tax to fund roads and the state's obligations to address salmon recovery and salmon barriers, as well as other priorities. There will also, for sure, be proposals around some version of putting a price on carbon and linking that to transportation. That's something that we can all engage in what shape we want it to look like. Our state certainly needs new revenue, so we want to pay attention to what that is in play. So fundamentally, we are in the transportation space and really across all the climate work, breaking the monopoly of the oil industry, and to do it in a way that invests in clean energy economy and a clean transportation system for all of us. Thank you for hosting this and having me. Thanks.
Yeah, so thank you, and I think Michael did a pretty good job introducing me. I'm Don Mackenzie. I lead the Sustainable Transportation Lab at the University of Washington, and I guess the only thing I'll say about our lab and our work is that just because we study something doesn't mean we think it's sustainable. We study a lot of things to see just how sustainable or not sustainable they are. So I was asked, sort of to give some perspective on where the big opportunities are for greenhouse gas reduction. And so one of the things that one of the first things I teach my students is that there's basically 4 levers we can pull on when we want to try and reduce emissions in transportation. So the first of those is travel less. So have fewer people miles of travel. The second is increase vehicle occupancy, so you're generating fewer vehicle miles for every person mile. The third is better fuel economy, use less energy per mile. And the fourth is use alternative fuels that are less emissions intensive for per unit of energy. And so pretty much anything we can do boils down to one of those 4 things, and there are trade-offs sometimes between those. I don't want to get bogged down on those here. I will say that from my perspective, in the near term, the biggest opportunity is in improving fuel economy. There's a lot of established technology, and there's a history of incremental improvement that adds up over time in the automotive sector. So between 1975 and 2009, for instance, enough new technology entered the new car market in the U.S. to cut emissions by 70% per mile. A lot of that was realized. A lot of it was not realized. It went instead to increases in acceleration performance and other attributes that are valued by customers like that. But in the near to medium term, that's really the big opportunity. Alternative fuels, whether electrification or something else, can make an impact in the medium to long term, but that impact depends on what fuels we're talking about and how they're produced. The challenge when we talk about alternative fuels and fuel economy is that these are largely federal, with the exception of states can opt to follow California standards on greenhouse gases per mile, which is essentially fuel economy. So there's an option for states to opt into that. But locally, there's not a lot that sort of local governments can do on alternative fuels and fuel economy. What they can do, though, is focus on travel demand and mode split and land use. And these can make meaningful contributions to cutting greenhouse gas emissions. So, for instance, TRB report from 2009 estimated that you could cut greenhouse gas emissions by about 11% over 40 years through a very strong focus on dense land use development. Cambridge Systematics, a transportation consultancy, estimated about a 24% potential reduction in greenhouse gases through pretty much a full court press on land use, promoting transit, pricing roads, all of these things, as well as improved operational efficiency. So those are meaningful, those are worth pursuing, but they're not going to get us to the kind of numbers that we now know we need to get to stop the worst effects of climate change. So the last thing I'll say is that I think when we think about policy at the state and local level, there's a couple of big things we should think about. One is leakage. So there are things that we can do as a state or as a local government that may help to increase fuel economy, for instance. But depending on how those policies are implemented, much of that benefit can leak out to other jurisdictions. Because we have a binding federal standard on vehicle greenhouse gas emissions, for instance, there are certain policies we could implement that would increase fuel economy in our state, but would basically allow the auto industry to sell higher emitting vehicles in other states that would offset that benefit. And so the details of the policy matter if we care about actually reducing emissions. The second thing is to I guess, reacting a little bit to some of the comments from my colleagues here, to remain cognizant of the effects of local versus global pollution. And so, for instance, though disadvantaged communities may be hardest hit, and we expect that they would be hardest hit by the impacts of climate change, that doesn't necessarily follow from there that that's the place to target investments in mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions. It means they are probably stronger candidates for adaptation dollars, but that doesn't really tell you that that's the best place to cut emissions, because we're talking with greenhouse gases about global pollutants, and it's just as important to cut those from advantaged areas as from disadvantaged areas, because the effects are cumulative and global in nature. So I will stop there and look forward to your questions.
Thank you, panelists. I know it's a pretty lofty task to distill a life's work or a lot of really good work into 5 minutes, but I appreciate you doing. No, you did actually. We are right on time, so double kudos to all of you. So thank you for sharing. So now it's time for questions. So some of you have already done so, but if you have questions, please pass your note card to the aisle, and then staff is walking around to pick them up. Even though I have some, I'm going to ask a question of my own first. And so I have that privilege, so I'm going to take it. So I'm going to ask a fanciful question because we're often kind of stuck in the doldrums of kind of realities and the practicalities of legislating. So I have a magic wand. The legislature and the governor will pass a dream bill of your organizations. So what is it? And it's not, let's not make it an omnibus bill. It's a discrete one-item goal. And then there's a second part to this question, but I don't want that to influence your answer. So very, very briefly, can you tell me what that dream bill would look like? Start with Bryce.
To kind of get at all of it, I think it would actually be embedding the Obama-era affirmatively furthering fair housing rule, which actually increases investment in communities while also looking at trying to figure out how do we create new housing units in areas with high opportunity. So it kind of gets at the cornerstone of some of the transportation, building new communities, and finding that equity.
How many of you know about the term just transition? So that would be my answer. Just transition means moving away from an extractive economy to a regenerative economy. It doesn't mean that it's just transportation related or labor related, but it has to do with everything else and how we actually operate at this moment, this entire economy. Having more power to the communities who face the vulnerabilities the most. That would be my magic wand wish.
I'm with Debolina, and I would add that would be embedded in the budget decisions, so that the just transition, the moving off fossil fuels, investing in the communities is reflected in our priorities for funding.
So I want to be clear that I don't speak for my organization, the University of Washington. I'm not even sure if I'm allowed to advocate policy while wearing my UW faculty hat. What I will say is that from my perspective, we're not going to get to the kind of emissions reductions that climate scientists tell us we need to if we don't have a consistent and steadily rising, predictably rising price on greenhouse gas emissions. To my mind, that is the single most important policy that we need to deal with greenhouse gas emissions. It is necessary, but not necessarily sufficient. So that's not to say that I'm not sort of a rabid, Chicago school economist here, that we need to, we just price carbon and everything will work out. But until we have that price, everything else is basically fighting against the tide.
Thank you. And so the second part of my question is, what is preventing that dream policy from being implemented? And very, very briefly, because we have really good questions here that I want to get to, if you could in one sentence say why won't your policy be implemented?
What was the second half of that question?
so you just
thinking about my answer and trying to figure out how much trouble I'm going to get in.
Yeah. So first of all, please don't get in trouble on my for my question. So you can say pass. But you just listed your dream bill. It's going to, in a dream world, it would pass without question. So now we're back to reality. In one sentence, what is preventing that from actually? What is preventing your dream bill from passing right now?
Money and political will.
Recognizing power structure, understanding who has and holds power, acknowledging that, and transferring that power to communities.
I would add the oil industry and the utilities that are so tied to them.
Yeah, I wish I knew. We've had 2 attempts at this now. I'd say what's stopping it is voters don't want a price on carbon. And so I think our elected officials are responsive to that. So if you want me to get in trouble, how about I say too much democracy?
Thank you for indulging me in that. We're going to turn to the audience now. So we've gotten a couple. So first of all, please continue drafting questions and passing them along. So a couple themes that are appearing in the 7 questions that I have before me relate to existing infrastructure and how we can improve that. So that includes variable tolling, dedicated transit lanes. So how can we expand, for example, for variable tolling, how can we expand what's on the State Road 520 and similar to dedicated lanes? What are your thoughts on those? Are they working now? And can we expand them into the future? And that's for anyone who wants to be bold.
I can start, because I'm not going to take a position, or I don't think I have enough expertise to say how you can expand these. What I can say is that we probably should find a way to expand them, much as with carbon. You know, if we have congestion on our roads and it's caused by a lot of single occupancy or low occupancy vehicles, we can trace that in large part to the fact that it's free to travel or almost free to travel on our roads. So when you or I use road space, we're taking it away from someone else. And so this is, we are contributing to that congestion. And so if we want to reduce congestion, we should charge people for the congestion they create. We also need to realize that that's going to create an incentive for people to share rides, whether it's pooling in services like Uber, whether it's using modes like bicycles or walking that use less road space, or whether it is taking mass transit. Those are going to all become more competitive relative to driving alone, but not until people are paying full freight for the road space that they use.
I would say real quick to kind of add on to that is the 405 high occupancy toll lanes that have been in effect north of Bellevue has some discernible positive impacts, especially for transit. We're seeing an 8 to 12, I think it's 8 to 12 minute increase in travel times, or decrease in travel times for a host of Sound Transit buses that run along that corridor. And we're talking a big impact when you take into the account the amount of people that are riding those buses. We also do realize, though, that when we talk about pricing our roads and congestion pricing, we have to take into account our land use policies and us pushing low-income individuals further and further out that might not have access to the transportation and transit infrastructure needed to support that. So while they are a positive movement, we just have to make sure that the implementation of those and the impact of those either aren't only borne by those who can afford to ride in those lanes, but also make sure that it's not disproportionately impacting communities who have been pushed out of where they either want to live or can live at this point.
Thank you. Rebecca or Debolina? No? Okay. So we'll move on. Looking at what we got before me, let's see. We'll dive into some technical. Thanks. How do you approach freight delivery, especially maritime emissions? You don't have a prepackaged solution to this already? How about we
Maybe
can...
part of freight delivery sort of implies something different than emissions, than shipping.
Yeah, that's a good point. So how about we, because I'm actually working on this right now with my colleague Joshua Berger, who is doing the Governor's Maritime Blue. How about we talk about maritime emissions and port emissions? I know that WEC has been doing a lot of work on drayage and port. So we've been talking a lot about on-road transportation. State of Washington has some critical port infrastructure as well that are sources of emissions for underserved communities. Do you want to talk about that? Thanks, Don, for rephrasing too.
I can start. We see this issue. It's obviously very multifaceted, but it's greenhouse gas emissions. An important part of that are the co-pollutants that go with those emissions. Applying a lens of where are those communities that are in the crosshairs of the transportation system. Many of them are along the port or the drayage truck routes that are quite acute in terms of contaminants. And so thinking about that is it is a sticky wicket, is my experience, but moving towards electrification of those vehicles and at the very least, lower emitting vehicles. So something like a clean fuel standard would require that, a low carbon with a co-pollutant overlay would be great to require those trucks to operate cleaner, in a more clean way. Thinking about port infrastructure and investing in the offshore or the shore power and the electrification so that the trucks can plug in. Currently, Debolina, I think, touched on this. Those trucks are extremely expensive, but they are getting, over time, you have to invest in them and they will get less expensive, and especially for the drayage trucks that have they're the short haulers. So there's a ton of emissions just in those, highlighted in those communities. If we can really focus on those types of trucks, you do have a big improvement for greenhouse gas emissions and those communities. That would be a start.
Just to add to what Rebecca just said and to expand on what kind of communities live around those places, so the drivers of those trucks, they face a lot of those emissions themselves too. And, in Seattle, people living in Georgetown, in South Park, they live very close to the port. And a lot of us know about the report which says that people living in Georgetown and South Park, they live 12 years less than somebody living in Maple Leaf, so northern part of Seattle. 12 years less, that's the life expectancy. So that's how much they're exposed to overall pollution. I had something else in my mind. But completely agree to the points that you said, that electrification and changing from, if electrification is not available, then changing into a low carbon fuel standard for port vehicles overall would be important.
I'm actually going to disagree there. So I would say that this is a great example of a place where we do need to worry about local environmental impacts, because they're very clearly impacts that are disproportionately borne by, by disadvantaged communities. And so there's very much this local air quality issue that comes out of this. I don't think that worrying about these trucks in the context of global pollutants like greenhouse gas emissions is that important. And from a technical standpoint, at least, it makes not a lot of sense to tether low carbon to local pollution in this context. I think the priority there is to reduce those local pollutants, the particulates, the ozone precursors that are going to impact local air quality there. And I don't know, that can even sometimes come at a bit of a trade-off against global emissions. So, to install stronger pollution controls on these vehicles can actually lead to higher emissions, higher greenhouse gas emissions. That's not to say you shouldn't do it. It is probably a worthwhile trade-off to make in that context because of the severity of local impacts that you get from those diesel emissions. But I don't know that a low-carbon fuel standard really has anything to offer in terms of improving local air quality in these disadvantaged neighborhoods.
I think it depends on how it's applied. If a low-carbon fuel standard is applied at the port by emphasizing electrification, it certainly does. If it's applied by perhaps increasing biofuels, maybe not. So the details are definitely important.
So we're going to change gears a bit on the subject. Now I'm going to bring it back to equity focus. I have a couple questions, and so keep in mind that there'll be sequential ones that are related. What processes do your organizations use to include underrepresented communities specifically in your legislative prioritization process?
I can start and this can pitch in. So for us, we We actually focus on South Seattle, Southeast Seattle, and expanding to South King County because a lot of our communities, who are communities of color and low-income communities, are forced out of their original neighborhoods because of gentrification and moving to South King County. We work with, in partnership with a lot of organizations here, grassroots organizers, God Green being one of them. DRCC, Duwamish River Cleanup Coalition, being one of them. So we take the cues on, what kind of policies we need to work on. For example, 1631 that we helped write, that was something that was highlighted as a priority by Front and Centered. Again, it's statewide EJ organizations. So that's how we decide on our policies and campaigns overall.
So Futurewise is another white-led organization that's going through multiple processes to figure out how's the best way to engage in our legislative process, especially in the land use sphere. We're a little bit behind on that in terms of just planning generally, but over the last year we've taken a few steps to get there, and I think the biggest one is thankfully TCC, who's hosting this, has brought together a larger group around long-term transportation funding and long-term transportation policies and outcomes. Futurewise, Transportation Choices, Climate Solutions, WEC, along with Front and Centered, are kind of going through a coalition process to figure out, are there areas of agreement that we can move forward with? And so we're starting those processes, and I think it's really exciting to see the outcomes that will occur. And hopefully we'll see them a little bit this session, but we're going to see them larger and larger in terms of how Futurewise incorporates that into our legislative agenda moving forward.
Can I also quickly add, the City of Seattle has their Environmental Justice Committee. I sit on that committee, and we also, with other members, we get to listen to what the other members' priorities are as well. So just wanted to add that.
So Washington Environmental Council, Washington Conservation Voters, I mentioned in my talk, we are on a journey with a racial justice plan, integrating that into our strategic plan, and on a journey on how to use our power to dismantle the systems of oppression. And the legislative session, particular bills, is in that mix, and there are a lot of other things in that mix too. We are part of a broader coalition of environmental organizations called Environmental Priorities Coalition, which identifies top priorities for all of us to focus in on heading into a legislative session, and we include a racial justice lens into the criteria of evaluating the policies that will become priorities. That is new. We are trying that out. It is not perfect in terms of how that's assessed, but we are being conscientious to integrate a racial justice component into all of our work, including the legislative work and all the coalition work we do. And it's an evolution.
I'm going to also take a very quick answer at this as well, because it impacts the work that I do. And so for those who are not familiar, Department of Commerce touches a lot of things in the state, and something that I hope to do starting in 2019 is convene an equity statewide work group on transportation and to figure out how that can those discussions and results of them can funnel into potential legislation, but really focus on how we at Commerce can improve our work around transportation. And so I've mentioned that to a few people, but I'm going to broadcast it more publicly. So if you know anyone who might be interested in that, please connect them to me, because I think there is a huge opportunity in getting those voices directly heard and removing any barriers to connect them to legislation and policy. So thank you for everyone for sharing that. I just want to say I'm getting a lot of good questions. Unfortunately, I can't answer all of them, or rather ask them.
Can I just add one more thing?
Yes, of course.
We're seeing, sorry to add this, but we, for the first time ever, a huge slate of freshman legislators are people of color and are women, and women of color. And that is a sea change. And so, our organization and all of us, I think, need to make sure that helps shift the tide on the development and implementation of policy. It is awesome that we saw that, and we need a lot more.
Excellent point. Oh, well, does Don want to answer the question?
No, I think that last
Yeah.
one doesn't really apply.
Yeah,
to me
I'm not.
in my position. Yeah.
I think that's a good point. Yeah, I'm not excluding. Don't worry. So following up on this, I actually really like this question, and it's related. As environmental and climate leaders, what is the common language you use when talking about communities of color and environmental justice?
Can you repeat it? Can you repeat the question?
Yes, sorry. As environmental and climate leaders, what is the common language you use when talking about communities of color and environmental justice? And so maybe we can think about when we talk to legislators and their legislative staff, there's a pretty expansive vocabulary to use, and it can be confusing for those who are not actively in the sphere. So I guess maybe that's a different way to frame it, is like, what is common accessible language for those who are not actively working in the equity space?
Disclaimer, I don't talk to legislators.
But if you did,
If I did, I do not know. But when we talk amongst our communities, one of the things that we bring up always is racial justice. And, the disinvestment and oppression that has happened, not just over here in the US, but all across the world, and how communities of color have been oppressed all over the world. So we really base our principles and values on that, and that's a language that our communities understand, and we can make help legislators also understand that, because it's not very difficult. You know what I mean? It's not very difficult.
yeah,
Just
totally.
acknowledge that these things have happened.
yeah.
So, yeah.
No, I appreciate that.
I also think we try and put a name on it, make it specific. So when you're talking about a clean fuel standard, what are the details that need to be changed to make it more equitable? I'm working on a 100% clean bill. What are the details that need to be in there to make that affordable for everyone and not have disproportionate impacts on lower income and people of color? So being there's the frame and the acknowledgement that we are living in a racist society that is very oppressive, and there are the details that are super important to change that.
I think the final thing that I'll add to all of this, and understanding that we still have a long way to go at the state in terms of educating legislators, but in addition, it's educating fellow lobbyists and advocates on understanding kind of where our line starts and where it ends. I think the one thing that I really take to heart after a number of conversations and a lot of work is making sure that communities of color, their voices are heard, and it's not me making that heard all the time, but providing them an opportunity and a space for that, and having me be a strong partner in helping that education, but understanding that it's the communities and their voices that really need to be heard in this situation, and it's not something that I feel like I'm comfortable doing, nor should I do. When we talk about specific policies, those communities and the impacts on them, their voices need to be heard, and they're the ones that we need to find a way to bring their voices up. We can't just expect them to speak all the time, and we've got to find that helpful space. And it's difficult in Olympia. So that includes resources and funding local communities so they can express their voice in Olympia and stuff like that.
So I want to, again, caveat that I don't spend a lot of time talking to legislators. I'll share sort of the last couple of years, though. I've had the chance to speak at a sort of a training institute for primarily state and provincial elected officials from across the U.S. and Canada called Lehigh, that's hosted out at Pacific Northwest Lab. And one thing that that is unique there is that you have folks coming to learn about energy and energy policy and climate policy to the extent it touches on energy policy, who are, run the gamut from the bluest of the blue to the reddest of the red. And so I think it is important. I guess what I've taken away from that is it's really important to tailor the message to the person that you're speaking with. And there can be trade-offs, I think, in linking explicitly with some audiences, with linking the equity and racial justice and environmental justice causes, as important as they are, to the climate issue. If the goal is to establish a stronger climate policy, this some people tune out, and you might say those folks, you don't need them, but I think that what we have seen is that we need to have a broader coalition in order to get sound climate policy passed.
Can I add something to that? I think it's incumbent upon everyone to understand that we live in a racist society and we have to shift that, and we have to do that policy by policy, conversation by conversation. And yes, of course, we have to tailor conversations to use language that is accessible to people, but we are in the situation we are in because we are not acknowledging it and talking about it and having our own responsibility in addressing racism and moving forward on an equitable set of principles, equitable policies. So I politely and very, very strongly disagree with the statement that you just said on not, some people can't deal with equity issues or racist issues. It's up to us to make sure that people are hearing and moving forward on. We are not going to address our climate change issues unless we do it in an equitable way. No way. So.
I was just going to add. Okay. Yeah, so thanks for being a great ally. And I do not see environmental justice as being separate from climate policy, because the impact of it is seen and borne by them the most, by communities of color the most. So they understand the impact, they have the solutions. There could be technical jargons, there could be people who are already in privileged positions to access technologies and other solutions that we haven't created, actually. The pathway hasn't created. So let's acknowledge that. And then, talking about investments, actually target the investments where they need to be. So I would also politely and respectfully disagree to your point.
Do we have time for one more question, or I think it might be, we can leave it at that, and I think that's a really excellent point to end at and really sit with. Thank you, panelists, for your time. I really appreciate your engagement and confronting some hard topics and confronting each other. Thank you. And thank you, everyone, for participating. And don't forget to, oops, sorry. So, there we go. I had written all over my notes. Remember to turn in your feedback cards at the check-in table on your way out. TCC will send today's recording along with another opportunity for continued conversation. Thank you all. Stay dry and stay warm.